Hi there. Today we are going to go over a quick introduction to sculpting. Now, digital sculpting is vastly different from traditional sculpting since you don't actually have anything physical to work with. But the mechanics of it are more or less the same, and we actually have different modes of sculpting when it comes to digital sculpting. So let's get right into it. I'm just going to delete this camera and the lamp here, and we'll select the basic cube here. Go to the front view and orthographic. Now, there are two ways to basically sculpt within Blender. And first, I'll show you the older way. So first, if we just move over to the modifiers tab, and I don't think I've gone over modifiers yet. They are basically, they add to the mesh or subtract from it. They can do many different things. So if, for example, you have a simulate tab here, they go over simulations, but what we want today is just the multi-resolution. And this modifier, which you can get from the wrench tab here, allows us to sculpt on a very basic mesh. So as you can see, if you go into edit mode, it's just the basic cube with 6 sides to it, 6 faces. But if we go into sculpt mode and we click the subdivide button, it will subdivide our mesh so that we can sculpt on it. So let's actually subdivide this a few times. Yeah, about 3 should work. And under this little multi-resolution tab, you have some options. Your preview option, which you will see in object mode. It will show you the highest level of preview that you have on your sculpt and render layers. The render option here shows how high of a resolution you want to render it at. And you usually want to leave that your highest. Your preview you can set down to whatever lowest amount you probably could, because this can make your computer run a bit slower. And then of course we have the sculpt option, which shows the density in sculpt mode. Now before we actually get into sculpting, I'm just going to go over some of these buttons here. So if we have, say, 15 layers on the sculpt here, but we only need, say, 10. And layers are basically just how many times you subdivide. So say we had 15. I'll just subdivide this a few more times, as much as I can. That's probably a lot. So say we have 6, but we only want 3. What we can do is move this back down to 3, click delete higher, and now 3 is our highest. That will also delete any detail that you had at that layer. Subdivide, of course, just subdivides. We have reshape and apply base, which aren't used completely often, so right now we don't have to worry about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a subdivision of 3, and what we'll do is we'll take our grab brush. So under the brushes tab, just click it and hit grab. Now this program is mainly button orientated for the workflow, so it's easier to actually just use buttons versus the options over here, because almost everything has a shortcut. So to scale this brush up, let's just hit F, and that will scale the size of itself. Now if you wanted to actually change the strength of it, holding down Shift and then F, you can see how strong the brush is, whether it has a 0% effect or a 100%, which is represented by 1. So what we want to do is have a bigger size brush, so just hit F, scale it to about the size you want, and we can just basically go in and just start moving around points to create whatever we want. Now something that's very handy when sculpting is going under the symmetry/lock panel and checking one of these options. Now if you're sculpting something with a symmetry across the left and right viewpoints, what you want is an X mirror if you're doing something with up and down, Z if you're doing something front to back, Y. If it's all 3 of those, you can check all of them. Now if you want to lock your editing so that you could not move things on the X-axis, as you can see here, selecting that option allows us only to move it on 2 axes, the Y and the Z. The same goes for the other ones. If you don't want to edit the Y or the Z, just click those. Or say you didn't want to edit any of those and only the X, clicking 2 of those. Now there's a multitude of brushes here, which we will go into most of them, but not all of them, because not all of them are 100% useful. to most people who do digital sculpting. Grab is obviously very important, and as you can see, I can use grab, and we've created a, I would say it's close to a basic head shape, very basic. And that's basically what this, it's simple as that. But if we wanted something other than the grab brush, like say we want to draw on the object, we have multiple options. So we have the sculpt draw, we have clay strips, we have clay, and we have layer. Those are the main tools used to actually draw on top of the object. Blob is also used as an additive type brush, but to add just a strip of clay down, you can either use layer or clay strips. I would recommend clay strips, as it is probably the best option you could have. And that basically just builds up the object as if you're adding on clay to the object. Now, if you wanted to, say, do a regular sculpting draw, which is basically you taking, say, if you had real sculpting tools and a piece of clay, this would allow you to basically act as if you had a tool in order to define certain areas of your object that you're trying to create. So this pulls out the mesh much more than the clay strips. Somewhat as if you're actually using your hands and pulling it, or perhaps adding. Or you can even subtract. So if you wanted to, you can just click subtract, and of course it does exactly as it says, and subtracts. Now, if you want to do this very quickly on the fly, what you can do is, I usually leave it on add, and say we want to add but we added too much. What we can do is hold down control, and that will choose the invert effect of this option. Now, certain brushes such as the grab does not have this option. So for that, the control would do absolutely nothing. One last thing before I move on to the second version of sculpting is the snake hook. The snake hook brush is something that is very difficult to use when using this multi-tiers or multi-resolution modifier, mainly because it just takes and stretches the polygons. And if we actually go into edit mode, which we can actually not see because it needs to be applied first, but you can actually see it stretches out the polygons a lot. And to make sure it doesn't do that, you can always just subdivide it, and it has more polygons to work with now, so that it doesn't stretch too much of the mesh. Now, there is a way around this, and that brings us to the second area of sculpting, which is dynamic topology. And it's a weird kind of name, I know, but what it basically does is if we enable it, you can see nothing happens. But if we go into object mode, or sorry, edit mode, you can see that the cube has turned into a triangulated faced cube, which basically means that all the faces are now triangles. And the reason that happens is because dynamic topology takes and you can actually dynamically add vertices and faces and edges to your mesh without having to do a multi-resolution modifier or going into edit mode and hitting subdivide. So the snake hook brush becomes much easier to use, because as you can see, it actually creates new faces instead of stretching out the ones you have. Now, the grab brush still works the same. You can only work with the faces that you have selected. So for example, I only have a few vertices here, and that's all that it can do, is just grab those vertices. So if you want to grab and extend pieces, snake hook brush works best for that. If you want to just grab the vertices, use the grab tool. And all the other tools work basically the same, except for instead of inflating the object or appearing so, it will actually add on top of it. So if we use the clay strips brush and say add on to here, just add on everywhere, you can see it actually adds on quite a bit. And now if we hit G for the grab brush, we can manipulate this into some shape or form. And depending on how much resolution you have on your mesh, which is resolution refers to how much or how many vertices are on your mesh, which you can actually find up here. Verts, it says 3,133. also tells you how many triangles you have. If this number exceeds, I would say, roughly 500,000, your machine may start slowing down. Certain computers can hit up to 1 billion, but for the average computer, I'd say 500,000 to, if you're lucky, 1 million vertices, which is actually quite a lot of detail. Now, you can see that some pieces on this are still very rough, and this is where I'll introduce the next brush, which is the smooth brush. And just as you would expect, it smooths it down. So it takes away all those harsh edges. It pushes down the mesh, kind of like if you were taking your thumb and running it across a piece of clay to soften it and smooth out any harsh corners on your object. And you can actually access this smooth button, or smooth brush, very, very quickly. So if we go to just any brush and say we're drawing on top of it, if we want to smooth this, we can hold down Shift and it will actually start to smooth the object. Alright, one last thing before we end this video and you get into the project is the mask brush. So the mask brush, what this does is you can actually, if you start using it, you can see the object turns black. And what this is doing is, if you ever use Photoshop, it's taking the object and painting over the vertices, and those vertices are now unmovable until you clear the mask. So because those ones are selected, I can go in and use the grab tool and say I want to pull in the sides here without affecting the front. That's what the mask brush allows us to do. Now if we go back there, we can go hide/mask, and it actually has options for us. So if we want to invert it, now we can just paint on a surface that we would like to actually use, and then just invert the mask to just move that area or work on that area. Now if you wanted to actually, you can fill mask, which fills the entire option, of course. If you want to clear it, you can either hit Alt-M or just go clear mask. And then you can see here we have lasso mask and box masks. So if we want to mask it, we can just hit B, box, and it will, anything that's within that box, it will select. So again, that's just B, click and drag, and it will select anything in that box. Alt-M clears the mask. And then lasso select, Shift Control left mouse. So if we try that, it will make us lasso, of course, and just select anything in that. Very basic, and it's a very powerful tool, especially with the dynamic topology option, because you can basically create anything you want out of literally nothing. Well, with the basic object, of course, but so just one last reminder: work with primitives when sculpting, mainly because if you're working with a 2D object such as a plane, that's as far as you can get. If you actually want to work with 3D, say you wanted to create a character or some other organic looking shape, this is probably the best way to do it, is with a primitive, because it's already 3D and you don't have to worry about it too much. But that is all that you need to know about sculpting, and yeah, that's it.